Adapt 2030 Mini Ice Age Conversations covers changes in our climate due to a new and intensifying grand solar minimum. In the media, overlooking, downplaying, or burying cold weather changes occurring on our planet. This is in order to keep the global warming agenda steaming full speed ahead. I do this podcast and radio program because we need to begin conversations on how to adapt our food growing strategies long before 2030 as agricultural zones shift, affecting global crop output, but very few mainstream media outlets are talking about the most important issue of our time, cold weather crop losses. Our sun is going through a 400-year cycle, which has effects on our weather patterns as our magnetosphere weakens and the jet streams go out of flow. It's not CO2, it's not you, it's the sun. Are you ready to thrive in the grand solar minimum? Then join me for Mini Ice Age Conversations. I'm your host, David DuByne. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I have with me Kevin Long from the longview.com.au. Now, Kevin from Australia has offered his quarterly website forecasting service since 2008 for farmers as a community service to help people navigate their way through cyclical, non-carbon dioxide climate change in southeastern Australia. Specific area on the planet. Kevin's based in Bendigo, Victoria, and he offers weather commentary for Murray-Darling Basin. And as we all talk about sunspot activity and lunar cycle influences, but Kevin takes it a step further by integrating global sea surface temperature anomalies, southern oscillation index, Madden Julian oscillation, the Indian Dipole, the Great Ocean Conveyor Belt, Thermohaline circulation that we hear so much about in the Atlantic Ocean. And he's put out the winter forecast for southern or southeast Australia, but since they're going into the springtime, it still is just as valid talking about the drier lunar air tide transition phase and what we can expect moving just as a planet down the road. With the 18.6-year lunar cycle influences up to 2020, and then a new cycle starts in 2028. What can we expect with wetter climates, drier climates? How is this going to affect our agriculture globally? But we have somebody here who is pinpointing a spot on the planet, and this is what I'm very excited about, is trying to get all of these people together to pinpoint everywhere on the planet where we grow a major abundance of our wheat and different crops that we consume, because we're going to have to start thinking about mitigating or moving grow zones, or at least trying to bring agriculture indoors as the natural yields in the outdoor environment start to diminish.
Well, I guess I'd like to highlight the fact that the lunar cycle is also enhanced by the planet cycle, the synodic cycle of Jupiter and Saturn. And when Jupiter and Saturn are closest together, as they will be next year and the year after, it has a minimizing effect on our rainfall. And that enhances the minimum effect of the lunar cycle when they're both working together. And that's what's coming up in the next 12 months, 2 years, is the first time in 297 years these two cycles are both falling in the same year. So they're having an enhancement of each other's cycle and creating greater extremes 9.3 years apart in our climate in Australia in particular. I got onto this many years ago, and I've been studying it, and I can see that over the last 50 or 100 years, as these two cycles have moved closer and closer together and finally become synchronized, in 2010 we had our wettest year ever on our record, some 50 millimetres higher than it was 37 years before at the previous cycle peak. Does that sort of get your ears open and say, well, what's going on here?
It does indeed, because even if we bring it up to a little bit closer time frame, all the floods where we saw the water coming off Ayers Rock and just the flooding of the deserts and the blooming and the greening of the outback that they hadn't seen in generations as well, now that all ties into it. But the most important thing is our crops. You talked about these overlapping cycles both occurring finally in the same year after 297 years. So think about what the extreme will be for lack of rainfall for this moving forward, because South Africa is going offline due to politics, And if Australia starts to go offline as well due to drought, where does that leave us with other possible substitutions for millions and tens of millions of tons of lost wheat
That's
production?
right. Well, this year in particular, New South Wales is, I think, 98% declared drought this year, and there's hardly a crop between the northern border and the southern border of New South Wales. And that represents about a third of the eastern half of Australia's food production. Half of Queensland is in a similar situation, and the northwestern half of Victoria is the same, and I don't think there'll be any profitable crops grown in possibly half of the Murray-Darling Basin this year, and the rest of it's going to be very poor as well.
So with the Bureau of Meteorology down in Australia, are they taking into consideration forecasters like yourself, or what Jennifer Morrissey is also talking about, these same cycles coming through? There's been a lot of manipulation in temperature data in the Bureau of Meteorology, but are any of their scientists or the government bodies in Australia taking a look at anything other than CO2 at the moment? Because moving forward, I mean, grain production is a major exporter and major earner for Australia.
The Bureau's forecast is for drier than normal conditions right through the spring. Their forecasts are similar to mine at the moment, but we're in extreme dry at the moment. Parts of New South Wales are only had about 20% of their normal rainfall for this year so far. And that means just nothing grows. And we've just about used up all the hay reserves that we had. And keep in mind that only 2 years ago, in 2016, we had one of our best growing seasons in living memory. We had 200% rain, started in about April and ran through to October. It was a very good season and grew possibly 6 times more hay than what we'd normally have. And that was, every hay shed was full 2 years ago, and lots of hay was stored outside. Well, it's nearly all gone. Nearly all been used up this year.
Yeah, I can say the exact same thing is happening in the southeast United States, because I've had a couple interviews with people, for example, Dr. Anita Bailey, who wrote the book Cold Times, and she's saying the same thing. Out in their farming communities there, they do not have enough hay. People are actually selling off part of their herds because they just can't afford to feed them. So when we get into this, hay is a luxury where they were actually trucking it in from different states, but the price on that was astronomical compared to what, and they're not even getting 2 cuts out of the field. They were barely even getting 1. So
from Tasmania up to the middle of New South Wales at something like $400 a round bale. And farmers just can't afford that. They're going broke just trying to keep their breeding stock alive.
Yeah, and that is the same story again and again that you're hearing around the planet. And I don't care which continent you're on. It's happening in Asia, but it's more with bird out here. It's the same thing. The feed is just getting too expensive for the animals. So at what point does the feed get too expensive for people when they can't really afford it anymore? And what's the pushback in society going to be? That's a whole different discussion than what's driving the weather with, sunspot activity and lunar cycles. But again, it all kind of winds back together with the civilization cycle, extreme boosts in creativity and knowledge and arts and literature, and then we have these dark areas, if you will.
I see that whenever we have a solar minimum cycle as we're having, the capitalistic societies of the world are going to be under great pressure.
Yeah, and maybe that would explain some of the crazy politics that we look and see today, because if you look the way a lot of monetary policy is globally and how politicians, or at least leaders of governments across the planet, are behaving, you look at that and say, that's not right. Why are they doing that? But, again, I think it's all tied together. I think it just has to be, because in your own opinion, where do you think we're going into in terms of cooling for the globe? Are we going to drop 1.5 C? Because in your website, you talked about the Maunder minimum, the Dalton minimum, these grand solar minimums themselves.
All I can say is I would expect that we're going to move back to the same sort of temperatures that we were in the early 1800s when we're having the Dalton minimum period. I'm not really convinced we're going to go back to the Maunder minimum period at this stage, because I think that occurs in the middle of the 1,000-year cycle. So we've got a while to go before we come into one of those again, I believe.
Yeah, so you used the word homogenization there, and I'm familiar with it, but a lot of listeners are not. We have the raw data sets, then we have this homogenized set.
Essentially, the Bureau is not accepting any weather recordings and weather information prior to 1910, because they're saying that the Stevenson screen wasn't standardised across Australia, so any of those earlier figures are not relevant. They could use computer models and do the corrections between the Stevenson screens and the various other systems that were in play before the Stevenson screen was put in. But as well as that, what they also do is, back in the early period, whenever they saw an extreme hot day, they say, well, that day can't be right. We'll have to replace that a bit of information with another weather station and use the information from another weather station and slot it in. So what they're actually doing is taking the peak temperatures out of the early part of our temperature records and replacing it with lower figures to enhance the upward climb of temperature from 1910 to present. You might realise that 1910 was the bottom of the 60-year heat cycle. Heat cycle peaks 1880, 1940 and 2000, and in between each one of those you have about a 0.2 of degree lower temperatures occurring. When you get Jupiter, Saturn and Uranus together, or you get Jupiter and Saturn and Neptune together, these planetary movements create a little rise in the world's temperature whenever you get a concentration of planets in one sector of planetary system.
Yeah, that's right. And Theodore Landscheid had mapped that out. And again, when we come to 2023 and 2024, we get into that quadrant out there where all four of the gas giants are directly in front of the Earth.
What that is doing is moving the Sun off the center of the barycenter. So the barycenter then moves outside the diameter of the Sun. And that causes the Sun to go into solar minimum periods.
Yeah, you'd have to see the diagrams to understand that. It's more like you're looking at the sun, and if you have a stencil graph, the way it moves around above and below and off that actual center point, that would be literally the center of the sun and the center of the sky as you look at it in view. It might spark the seed for somebody to do some of their own research, because that's kind of what the point of these interviews are is, yeah, I can bring you some information here, but you should be doing some of your own research to really follow up and find, is what we're talking about true or not true? I mean, the IPCC has told you it's been warming and it's all CO2 and it's man influence and we're warming the planet, but we're giving you an entirely different data set over here saying, hey, this is completely something other than CO2 happening on our planet with extraterrestrial, if you will, off the Earth. We have the sun, we have the planets, there's electromagnetism, Birkeland currents, we have all these things happening that also affect our weather systems, our jet streams, and it's not all CO2. You know, Kevin, I had a quick question for you. The Madden Julian oscillation, I'm not really too familiar with this one.
It starts off over near the Horn of Africa, and it travels under India and cross through New Guinea and out into the Pacific Ocean. It does this on about a 6-week period. And when this Madden Julian oscillation is travelling just through New Guinea and slightly east of Australia, it has the ability to raise the moisture content over that area, and then that gets flushed into Australia. So when the Madden Julian oscillation map is divided into 8 sectors, so we find in eastern Australia we get about 25% of our rain when it's in phase 1 and about 60% or so when it's in phase 5. And the other phases are not very productive in rain. So it's just another little assistance, you know, that works and when it's in the right place.
When you look at longer term durations too, the intertropical convergence zone moves north or south in these grand solar minimums. So you can also imagine some of these other, what this Madden Julian oscillation might also be fluctuating more north or more south as the intertropical convergence zone itself moves more north or more south. The moisture records are very clear, you know, looking at the stalactite core samples after you slice those open like tree rings. I mean, it's very clear that those moisture patterns move.
We have mega-droughts in Australia that they've been recorded throughout history in tree rings and in trees that have grown in the bottom of rivers and they've grown in the bottom of lakes. And these trees have grown for 60 or 70 years at a time without ever being killed by a flood or water. Now, not very far away from where I've lived all my life, there's a 40-foot deep lake, a mile in diameter, has no outflow. It can only dry out by long periods of low rainfall. And in the bottom of that lake are many tree stumps which are nearly a metre in diameter. And one would have to say, well, it must have been very, very dry to grow trees like that in those lakes. Now, I believe that's the type of cycle that we're facing over the next 20, 30, 60 years, because they seem to occur when we have a solar minimum cycle, When we have that, we get greater levels of sea ice around Antarctica, and when we get greater levels of sea ice, we get dry air moving into Australia, and our rain systems basically shut down.
When we're doing forecasting, especially my whole crux on the bringing the information of the Grand Solar Minimum is our crops are going to be affected. So think about that. If Australian production's affected, South American production's affected, and South African production's affected, those are exporters to other nations. So if they can't export those tens of millions of tons, where are those other countries that are used to getting those exports from Australia or from South Africa, where are they going to in turn get that from another place? Because the United States is going down in production. Canada's down. China's down. So where's the rest of the draw going to come from? This is what makes no sense to me with the USDA calling 40 million tons down on the carryover stock already. And it's like, wait a second, I thought it was supposed to be a good harvest, but they're already calling 40 million ton drawdown. What? Where'd that come from? So I don't know where the push and pull is going to come from on the supply side going into the future. Maybe not this year, but what you're talking about, prolonged drought.
My area of Victoria here in the 1970s had its wettest decade ever at 627 millimetres average. The next decade, the 1980s, was 572. The next decade was 536, and the decade 2000-2009 was 418. So we've lost long-term a third of our rainfall within 30-40 years. The rainfall this year in most Murray-Darling Basin is well below any period of that time.
So coming back to the local area where you're at there, are the local farmers talking about this? Do they understand the mechanisms of what's causing these cycles of wetter climate and drier cycle?
They're standing their bum up in the air and they hope for rain. They are the internal optimists. And some of my clients are saying, please don't send me any more bad news. Our local ABC radio will not have me on the radio. I used to do a program like we're doing now, a talk with our local ABC best announcer that I think I've ever seen in Australia, Jonathan Rignall, and yet when I started talking about global cooling and a mega-drought coming, the message came down from up top. Please, do not have Kevin on anymore. We don't want to have any more of that message.
In your opinion, what do you think the reason is for this? And take it the next step further. That's the whole thing. I can't get it past a couple of steps. They want to keep pushing it further with the global taxes, etc. I understand that. But then what's the end move, though, at the very end there? What's their prize that they're trying to claim by pushing global warming in every single news outlet, even though it's cooling, and then try to pass global taxes? Every time I talk about sun cycles, I suddenly have a Wikipedia entry slammed under my video guaranteeing you that I could be false news by talking about non-CO2 driving the climate, that there's other factors.
As in lunar cycles and planet cycles and solar cycles. And sea ice cycles, right? Sea ice cycles are very powerful on our climate.
And what about all the aerosols that's putting up in the atmosphere? I mean, what about Asia? Are you kidding me that China has no effect? You know, I'm singling out a nation, but I'm just going to say Asia in general. How much aerosol pollution's out of there? How much is coming out of the U.S.?
The atmospheric pollution coming out of China and Asia, Indonesia, and that moving into the areas north of New Guinea, that was keeping that area warm like a little blanket, and that was holding the monsoon season in the northern hemisphere longer than it would normally be. So hence we only have a monsoon season down here now of about 3 months long. The monsoon stays in the northern hemisphere for about 9 months of the year. So that's why one of the reasons why we are having droughts in Queensland.
And if that projects out and keeps going for the next decade, where does that take us?
Queensland has up to 7 years with low rainfall, but down here in Victoria, it usually only lasts for one season at the peak of an El Nino event, and usually the year after an El Nino event is a above average year, and we saw that in 2016. We had a strong El Nino event in 2015. That blew a lot of moisture and heat up in the upper atmosphere, and 6 months later that was travelling over Australia, and wacko, we had 200% rain for 6 months while it was here. And then as soon as it sort of left Australia, it created a sea ice crash of about 6 times the normal rate that we see sea ice being lost from Antarctica. So we went from the highest ever measured sea ice extent in Antarctica to the lowest in just over 12 months. And that's like 6 times faster than normal, because it normally takes about 3 years to go from the high point to the low point. And we normally only move down about a third of the way that we did this time. Have a look at the graph. the sea ice graph, the long-term sea ice graph on Climate for You. Our local paper wouldn't print the letters that I wanted to send into the letters of the editor in their form that I put them in. They had to change them and alter them and make them not make sense, so I ended up setting up a website so I could put that information out.
Yeah, and again, that website is thelongview.com.au. Yeah, and over there on the right side, you'll see where it says links inside there, and there's also supporting documents. The current forecast, which I know you just put out, you said you put out the spring forecast. There's so much else going on. You talked about the sea ice cycle. Now, in your opinion, what is going to happen? I have my own opinion about the northern hemisphere and the Arctic sea ice due to cooler water being pushed under the ice cap for the next 9 years for the Atlantic waters with the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation. But with the drying effect you're talking about and the drought occurring and going to amplify, what will this do with the Antarctic?
That is associated with the development of an El Nino cycle. When an El Nino cycle is building, you are storing heat on the equator and you're starving heat from the polar region. So we see a growth in sea ice at that time. And as the sea ice grows and the El Nino builds, our climate dries out here in Australia. So we move down to about 50% of average rainfall normally. Under extreme points, every 37.2 years when we have the lunar cycle working with the monsoon cycle, we see the extremes get greater. We get wetter years in the wet part of it, and we get drier years 9.3 years later.
9-year cycle seems to be a thing in the northern hemisphere as well for the pulse water going under the Arctic ice sheet. So now it's kind of confirmed that there's going to be sea ice growing in the southern hemisphere and sea ice growing in the northern hemisphere. So I'm wondering how the IPCC is going to start to explain away all of these sea ice growths that we're no longer going down to the low points, that now from every year forward it's going to continue to increase. So any projections on how they're going to try to sell this to the public? Remember when we were told snow would be a thing of the past? Well, now they're saying global warming creates more snow because of more evaporation in the oceans.
And yet for 30 years we've had a growing sea ice caper in Antarctica. On average it's been growing for 30 years now. And yet nobody in Australia knows that. Hardly anybody. They all concentrate on what's been happening in the northern hemisphere. That's what comes on our media. And the Arctic has been declining for the last 30 years, and the Antarctic has been increasing for the last 30 years. Now, I believe the Arctic is still decreasing because of the extra land mass in the northern hemisphere, land being a better solar collector than sea. So we're still seeing heat building up in the northern hemisphere 30 years after we started to lose heat out of the southern hemisphere. Right? Because of our larger sea masses in the southern hemisphere, we're seeing the first effects of global cooling in the south, not in the north.
Well, I'm going to add a little information. It is just this year's information. It does not even go any further than just a few months back. Northern Hemisphere had all-time record snow cover for the Northern Hemisphere, something like 700 billion extra tons of snow on the ground for a longer duration. And you know the albedo effect. So what you just talked about seems to be in its, shall we say, downward spiral because all the extra snow, they even talked about this in several articles with the amount of intense snow cover and far above the norm across the Northern Hemisphere, that what you're talking about, absorption into land and ocean, specifically land, just didn't occur as quickly as it could have this year because of the extended snow cover across this part of the world up here. So that's kind of a new one in there. You can find the Northern Hemisphere snow totals, and you'll see that red line just straight above the averages and completely just, whoa, it's so far out there they need to put a new band up there for a snow total. That was interesting to see them. So when you were talking about the drier lunar air tide transition phase, is that correct?
So it's 10 days short of a year, which means that the southern air tide has a peak each year, but next year it'll be 10 days earlier in the year. And it slowly works around the calendar backwards, and it takes 37.2 years to circulate right round through 1 year. So when you have the southern air tide working in the middle of the winter time, it is able to produce more rainfall than when it's working in the summertime. And consequently, the same thing occurs with the northeast air tide, which occurs almost 6 months before or after the peak of the southern air tide. And when the northeast air tide is working in the middle of summer with the monsoon season, that's one of the drivers of these big rainfall events that we've just had in 2010 and the previous one in 1973. Does that make sense? Have I explained it well enough?
Absolutely. Going through here, I'm going to include graphs and charts inside every segment that we've talked about so you can get a visual representation. You know, the podcast is one thing. You can listen to it on the go. You can listen to it while you're working out, while you're driving to work. But when you do get back, make sure you hit the video on YouTube because I'm going to add all the slides in so it's very crystal clear on what we have been talking about. Because really, a picture is worth 1,000 words. We could try to describe charts and graphs, but until you actually look at it.
Time and time again, when they forecast rain events and they just fade away and they don't work because the air tide is working against it. Or in other times, we get a rain event that they didn't forecast because the rain event came on the peak of an air tide.
You know, and that seems to be sort of a standard thing where they forget variables in the models, but they guarantee you the model it's so perfect that it is forecasting out 200 years. But they forget so many of these cloud cell variables, they forget so many natural variables inside there, even galactic cosmic rays, etc. And they expect us to, take their word for it as
That's
the gospel
right.
truth that this model is the thing that's going to forecast out. But how do you forecast when you're forgetting parts of the whole? It seems like you have quite a few of the drivers that they don't take into consideration. And when I say they, I'm talking about the United Nations bodies that are putting out all the information that continue to stem us down this road of global warming. I'm really concerned about global cooling, though, because it comes to our food production, and people are going to have to learn how to grow their own food again. I believe that's going to be part of the transition phase here into the cooler climate. Well, you talked about economy and, just-in-time delivery, and these types of systems are going to have kinks in them that break at points. So something might not get delivered to your local community. You'll be on your own, more or less, for some of the foodstuffs.
We pay $7,000 a megalitre for our water by the time it's delivered to us.
Yeah.
That's what it works out to. Now, somebody can't grow food economically paying $7,000 a megalitre for their water. The farmer can't hardly do it when he has to pay $100 a megalitre. People now don't water their gardens. They don't water their nature strips anymore. The Water Authority can't sell enough water to cover their costs.
And I want to take it into electricity also, because that would be a driver too. If you're going to try to do indoor agriculture, mechanized agriculture, you're going to need electricity, obviously. But during that really cold event, the super freeze, I'll call it 1.0, that swept across Australia earlier in the season, they were charging up to 14,000 Australian dollars for a megawatt of power because with the cloudy conditions and the wind being off, that they weren't generating from the renewables at the point that they thought they would. And because of that, people were heating their homes more. There was just more drawdown on all the available power. So what did they do with the major producers? I think it was exclusively smelters and other larger industries. They jacked the price to 14,000 Australian dollars for a megawatt. That is incredible.
That's right.
How people could even consider paying that on the retail level. What's that, $14 a kilowatt? That's insane. How could you even pay that?
We cannot run agriculture as we've known it in Australia, not over the wider areas. There might be some small coastal areas that has higher rainfall that can still be productive, but the greatest majority of inland Australia will be non-productive.
Oh, you just shattered a lot of people's hopes and dreams right there, because they thought they would be able to grow their own food to try to get through this grand solar minimum. But that is just another bottleneck to think about. Is your local area going to dry out where there won't even be access to enough water to continue to grow what you might need out for your family to supplement?
25 millimetres a month. So how much can you grow on that?
You'd have to really seek out the very drought-hardy plants such as moringa, or something that grows under duress and likes drought conditions to grow and thrive. And if it gets extra water, it even produces more leaf or fruit. That is a constraint to think about that I haven't really put into my equations. This is where it comes into, when the back's against the wall, the ingenuity of the human spirit to create new devices or invention that was not there before to solve a pain point or a bottleneck at this juncture always seemed to come out of the woodwork somehow. So I'm curious if this time, if water production could be the same way.
For the right conditions, you get a lot of water condenses and pours off the pipes. But you've got to have fairly moist air to do it. So it works well within the coastal regions of a country where you've got 80 or 90% humidity. But if you're only running about 10 or 20% humidity, as we are for most of the year in inland Australia, you don't get very much water. You've got to have a very cold pipe to condense water out of 10 10 and 20% air.
Yeah, which means more electricity, and you cannot squeeze blood from a stone.
That's all right, David.
Well, I don't even know where to go with that. I'm going to have to rethink a lot of things myself, because that was the last equation that, thank you for filling that in. What can people garner from the reports, or farmers, people in the agricultural community out there? The longview.com.au subscription service there. And again, you can talk to Kevin directly if you're in that service. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, Kevin. Great interview, and I'm so thankful that I had a chance to talk to you and share ideas. And I'll leave all the links below in the description box so you can go directly to the site.
Goodbye, David.